It wasn't an algorithm. You need to understand that first. The images and sounds you were shown, the cryptic numbers that appeared in your recommendations, that was a signal, a tuning fork resonating with something already inside of you. You were chosen because you are one of the few who senses that the reality we see is just a fraction of the whole story, a beautiful, hypnotic, but fragmented echo. For months, you've been collecting those echoes, feeling their power without understanding the source. Consider this video the first translation of that source. This is not another theory or a guess. This is the blueprint, the very architecture of the philosophy you've been subconsciously drawn to. What you are about to see is the key that elevates you from a mere spectator of the mystery to an active participant in its unfolding. The puzzle pieces are in your hands. Now, let's begin to assemble them.
For history, there is perhaps nothing more embarrassing than unearthing a gear wildly out of place. Imagine a stray piece of metal resting in a layer of ancient sediment where it simply should not exist. A mechanism centuries ahead of its so-called official invention. It is as if an unseen hand has leafed through the grand book of technology in the wrong order, carelessly leaving behind traces of pages that have yet to be written. We are taught to believe in a timeline that is compact, elegant, and strictly progressive. A world where every innovation claims a rightful father, a precise date, and a logical context. Yet, every so often, an anomaly surfaces to fracture this delicate choreography, confronting us with what can only be called an invention ahead of its time. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, a bronze relic hauled from the depths near the Greek islands in 1901. Its dizzying array of gear wheels and precise astronomical calculations display a complexity that simply does not belong to classical antiquity, or at least to the schoolbook version you were given. It is a stellar clock that by all conventional logic should never have existed. Of course, you could say it is an isolated case, that ancient science was more refined than we imagine, that some ingenious craftsman had intuited what others forgot. It is an explanation, certainly, an explanation that nearly collapses under its own weight, but helps calm the anxiety. That same unsettling feeling you get, for example, when looking at Leonardo da Vinci's drawings. Delving into his cascades of spirals, armored vehicles, and flying machines, we don't so much pay tribute to his genius as we find ourselves harboring a suspicion that he had access to some archive from a parallel reality. Certain models seem more like memories of the future than inventions, as if the creative act were, in truth, a mnemonic one. This haunting aura of déjà vu that so often accompanies innovation leads one to wonder if every groundbreaking discovery is in fact a rediscovery. And while Nietzsche might interpret this as the eternal return, and Jung as a technological archetype, I would perhaps call it an invisible library floating in the ether, from which humanity occasionally steals a misplaced catalog card. And despite the seemingly philosophical nature of these musings, we must not forget that this philosophy is grounded in tangible artifacts, piercing the flesh of our accepted history like sharp thorns. You cannot ignore them. An iron nail embedded in a coal seam millions of years old. A light bulb in ancient Egypt, or so some interpret certain carvings at Dendera. Even if some are eventually proven to be hoaxes, the very persistence of such forgeries lays bare an obsessive human desire, a yearning to believe that the path of progress is not a straight line, but a fractal geometry teeming with hidden returns and mysterious bifurcations. We must recognize that the phenomenon of an invention ahead of its time often goes far beyond the boundaries of archaeology. It frequently manifests in the immaterial landscape of pure thought. In the 19th century, Charles Babbage conceptualized his analytical engine, a brilliant design that vastly outpaced the manufacturing capabilities of his era, while Ada Lovelace even managed to write algorithms for it, becoming the first programmer in human history. In these moments, reality seems to trudge slowly behind the restless mind, leaving the brilliant project to linger like a ghost, waiting patiently for a form. When the necessary body finally does arrive, be it the digital computer, the airplane, or the atomic bomb, it appears to us as new. And in truth, it is merely an ancient shadow that has at last found its material vessel. The paradox here is that the future usually feels agonizingly late, yet every now and then it swerves out of some parallel space into the oncoming lane and collides with us ahead of schedule. You might call this occurrence a technological anachronism or a historical anomaly, but I prefer to think of it as a catalog of inventions, a secret inventory belonging neither exclusively to the past nor the future, but to a mysterious elsewhere that bleeds freely into both. The traditional philosophy of science might dismiss these out-of-time objects as mere outliers or marginal deviations. Thomas Kuhn, contemplating his scientific paradigms, would likely smile at the sight of an ancient gear wheel and calmly suggest that the object itself is not out of place. Rather, our current paradigm simply lacks the framework to accommodate it. Yet I envision these anomalies differently. They are a faint, deliberate scratch on the glass of history. The scratch does not shatter the window, but it undeniably proves that the glass holding our worldview together is neither flawless nor eternal. This brings us to a subtle, inevitable irony. The very notion of linear progress might be a grand misunderstanding. We comfort ourselves with the belief that we are constantly marching forward, when in truth, we may be walking in vast, sweeping circles, occasionally stumbling upon the same machines we encountered in another rotation of the spiral. The so-called inventions of our modern age might simply be cyclical returns, as natural and inevitable as the shifting seasons. In fact, an invention need not be forged from metal. It can be a concept, a philosophical method, or a mathematical truth expressed too early to be deciphered. Consider the Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Indian astronomical treatise brimming with calculations that seem to belong to a far more advanced epoch, or the arcane alchemical diagrams that uncannily mirror the blueprints of modern chemical laboratories. Even the ancient myths, filled with flying ships and mirrors of fire, act as guardians of visionary projects cloaked in the colorful garments of legend. At times, I find myself thinking that reality itself functions as an invention that doesn't belong to its own time. It shows us signs we do not yet know how to read, symbols that will only make sense later. It is the poetic logic of synchronicity. The event arrives long before the world is ready to provide its explanation. Caught in this temporal web, we remain suspended, holding an isolated gear and wondering where the rest of the mechanism lies. This is the true, intoxicating fascination of the catalog. Its purpose is not to definitively prove that the ancients flew airplanes or engineered computers, but rather to gently remind you that time is not a sterile, linear corridor. Instead, it is an unstable weaving, a vast, intricate tapestry where the luminous threads of the future and the frayed edges of the past entwine without shame, leaving us to vainly attempt to order that which refuses to be tamed. Let me leave you with a final vision. Imagine standing in an immense, boundless hall without walls. Stretched before you are endless tables displaying the machines of every conceivable age, some brilliantly real, some forgotten, and others yet to be born. As you walk among them, certain mechanisms gleam with a familiar light, while others quietly beckon you with their impossible potential. In that breathless moment, You no longer know whether you are gazing at a past that never was, or a future that will never arrive. The profound truth dawns on you. The catalog does not belong to you. You belong to it. And in the end, perhaps the most ancient, anticipated machine of them all is the very illusion of progress, the relentless engine that propels us forward, even as we secretly know we are merely spinning in place. See you in the next episode.